This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome everyone to the Xcast. The truth is in here. This is our special Fight the Future Minute podcast. I'm Kurt North, and you are listening to our coverage of minute 82 of the X-Files Fight the Future. This minute begins at 81 minutes as a car drives through Washington, D.C. and finishes at 81 minutes 59 with Well-Manicured Man stating that the Ebola, AIDS are all newborn viruses. To discuss this minute, I'm joined once again by podcaster and writer Darren Mooney. Darren, how's it going today, mate? Viruses grow up so fast these days, right? They do.
How are things? I'm good.
Good. Yeah, I'm good. We've again during work still ongoing in this COVID-19 situation. Our numbers are down. We've got a city that's just about to go back into lockdown, which is our first localized thing. So that's really interesting in Leicester. So that's at the time of recording. So, and obviously we're about 3 weeks from this airing. But yeah, so interestingly enough, a lot of things going on at work and all kinds. But it's always a pleasure to be speaking to you about the X-Files and especially Fight the Future. So good to delve into this next minute. In the previous minute, we did talk about some of the film noir aspects and some of the so the technology behind how things worked and the projection and stuff like that. We talked about Kurt's file as well and a bit of Well-Manicured Man. So this minute starts to bring everything together, really, doesn't it? Because we get inside of Well-Manicured Man's car as Mulder and Well-Manicured Man in the previous minute are walking alongside of each other. And Mulder asks the question, what is it? Now, that question opens up quite a big exponential exposition piece, doesn't it, really?
Yeah. You're kind of waiting for the Well-Manicured Man to sit back and say, well, I'm glad you asked.
It's like, right, here we go.
I've been prepping this for months.
Exactly. But just before we delve into that, I just wanted to, just a couple of things that I've noted down here, that there is the longitude and latitude that I decided to look for because I'm that kind of person. So I look for it. It's difficult. There's no real video or satellite imagery of the area that I could find. But I did look for the what three words. Do you know what three words is?
Oh, yes. The what three words are the location where every place on Earth can be identified using 3 words down to, I think, is it a square foot or a square meter, basically?
Correct. So the longitude and latitude of the where Mulder needs to go is sidebars, Tington, deviousness.
That's not bad.
It's okay, isn't it? It's not bad.
Appropriate, I think, yeah.
This scene, as I say, started with Mulder saying, what is it? And it finishes effectively with the two major things in this, with Mulder's reaction being, this is what you've been conspiring to conceal? A disease? And obviously, from our previous minutes, way back when, no, for God's sake. So we get Well-Manicured Man saying God's sake, which is fantastic. So
that's like an or rating, I believe, in some countries.
Is it?
John Neville saying for God's sake is like a hard or, I think.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah. But we actually finished mid-sentence, so we don't get to the information about what the virus is. We actually get to the point where he's saying that it's on an evolutionary scale just before that, just during that scene there. But what did you make to this minute then? Just in general, we've got introduction of the vaccine. It's a weak vaccine. It's got to be administered within 96 hours. And there's just the general beginning of this exposition piece.
Yeah, it's a lot of it. Again, like, it's a large part of when we talked about the Well-Manicured Man the first time, we're like, yep, we are doing the exposition scenes. There is a lot of exposition, and it's going to be delivered damn well efficiently. And again, I think we'll be talking maybe, I think, in the next minute about some of the edits and the extended cuts of, like, Fight the Future.
Yeah.
And I hope you guys like exposition, because what was cut was even more exposition. But it's, again, very much kind of necessary stuff in terms of telling the audience kind of exactly what they need to know. And again, notable in terms of the X-Files for being surprisingly specific in terms of providing information. We've talked, I think, on the podcast before about, like, one of the things that I think works really well about the first couple of seasons of the X-Files, and up until about season 5, maybe even season 6, is the way in which Carter kind of writes this sort of exposition or this sort of plotting in a kind of a lyrical or poetic way, where it's kind of vague, it's ambiguous, it's philosophical, it's abstract. I think one of the big problems with the later seasons of the X-Files, particularly say season 8 and season 9, and I say absolutely loving season 8 to be clear, but is the way in which the exposition becomes a lot less lyrical, a lot less florid, and becomes a lot more, well, comic booky, for lack of a better word, a lot more specific and a lot more awkward, where you start asking actors to deliver phrases like super soldier with a straight face, and that's the point where you run into problems. But I do think that it is notable that, like, Fight the Future largely, you know, it does indulge in some of that in this sequence. You know, like, there is some florid prose, particularly from, like, John Neville. When you say anything in that sophisticated upper class British accent, it's going to sound inherently kind of like sophisticated and clever and witty and, you know, sort of very, you know, above board and well considered, lyrical and poetic and florid. But at the same time, and again, to be fair to Carter as a writer, but also to be fair to, like, Carter as a producer and somebody sitting in the ending bay, the film understands that its audience isn't necessarily interested in long monologues about abstract concepts. You're not going to get an audience packed into a cinema to watch Redux 1 or Redux 2. In fact, as I'm saying this, part of me is wondering if Carter wrote Redux 1 because he had to kind of pent up all that narration and all that exposition while writing Fight the Future and just needed somewhere to put it, somewhere to channel it, kind of while he was working on the show or on the film. Because again, it is very efficient. It's very precise. You have, again, numbers. 96 hours. That's how long you have. A ticking clock. Very specifically stated, very clearly stated, very precisely sort of provided to Mulder, very clearly given to the audience to provide a sense of stakes to what's going on. Now, it doesn't actually matter how long it is. That number could be 72 just as easily, but it just has to be a specific number in order to set the idea of a countdown, because obviously we're not going to watch Mulder as he travels, you know, to the Arctic, or as he travels, you know, to the ship, because that's boring film. You know, that'll be a really boring montage. We know he's going to get there on time because we know that Scully's going to be back next year, for example. But, like, the fact that there's a number provided makes it more concrete. And again, the fact that when he gives Mulder the sheet of paper, and the sheet of paper has literal coordinates written on it, it's a way of communicating that this isn't something like, you know, take Talitha Kumi, for example. And again, I actually really, really like Talitha Kumi. But again, that abstract discussion of alien colonization, that abstract discussion of what the colonists are here to do and what they're planning, and this kind of use of florid and ambiguous language. This isn't that. This is very much, you're sitting in the front row of a cinema, you've got popcorn in one hand, you've got a big tub of Coca-Cola in the other. You want to know what's happening. I'm going to tell you what's happening. The big headline for this sequence is Mulder has 96 hours to get to this precise location and inject Scully with this exact syringe, and he might save her life. Those are the stakes in the movie. And again, it's something that shows remarkable, you know, restraint from Carter. I think, you know, given some of Carter's excesses in the past, and I say that as somebody who adores some of Carter's excesses, to be absolutely clear, but an understanding of the fact that who you're writing this movie for, who the audience is. I think when we talked about, you know, how we first saw Fight the Future, I explained that, you know, I was a kid at the time, so I dragged my dad to see it. My dad needed to be able to follow this, having never seen an episode of The X-Files. And I think that introduction allows him to do it, because it's like Dad can now kind of zone out for the next 90 seconds of this conversation because he understands what's at stake in the movie. And I think that there's, you know, an efficiency there that's commendable in terms of kind of writing an X-Files feature film. I do think there is some interesting stuff here before we jump into kind of like the next minute, before we jump ahead. I think that, like, what this conversation does in terms of exposition, and I kind of mentioned that, you know, you give the precise details beforehand, you give the 96 hours and the coordinates. There is a bit of florid prose here. There is a lot of good thematic stuff going on here. I mean, you know, you could argue that the Well-Manicured Man's understanding of biology maybe isn't too hot, in that, you know, I think that maybe most virologists wouldn't accept the definition of a virus as, quote, a colonizing force that cannot be defeated, living in a cave underground until it mutates, ... and attacks. I'm fairly sure that if you wrote that down in a biology exam asking what's a virus, you wouldn't get a pass on it. but it does sound really cool when you say it out loud. But more to the point, it kind of gets at these core themes of the X-Files, because like even when the Well-Manicured Man's providing exposition, you get this sense of what the X-Files is about and why it chooses this particular imagery and this particular iconography and this particular material to approach the subject. Because again, you know, we literally cut out on the minute at the mention of Ebola and AIDS. And those are two huge fears in the 90s. And I think when we've been on the podcast before, you and I, and me and Tony as well, when we talk about the black oil is a representation of that fear of viral infection. But viral infection in the 90s, you know, is something that was obviously brought to attention by books like, say, The Hot Zone, by movies like Outbreak. And I mean, it's notable that even before the black oil, you had episodes like F. Emasculata, which very clearly indicated that the X-Files was kind of interested in this idea. But one of the things that's interesting about the fear of viral contagion is the idea that it represents a number, it gets at a number of other core fears. The big one is the fear of body horror, the idea that your body might turn against you, that your body will be infected, that it will change, that it will turn into something monstrous and grotesque. And again, that's literalized in, say, movies like, say, The Thing, for example, or even like zombie movies where you get bitten and infected and your body changes. But even here, where you have like that alien idea, the idea that, you know, the creature's going to get in you, it's going to change your DNA, it's going to literally burst forth from you. The idea that your body, like the flesh and blood that you inhabit, is, you know, just a machine made of meat. It's just a resource that can be exploited and manipulated and destroyed. And you don't actually have any physical control over that. You actually have, like, as a human being, as like a mind, as an essence, as a consciousness, you don't necessarily control the functions and mechanics of what's happening in your body. And that is terrifying on an existential level. And kind of, you know, the idea that these changes can be so small and so indecipherable. It's not like nuclear war. It's not like a gun. It's not a stabbing wound. It's something you can't even see. And it's something that gets in there and attacks you. And that's what makes it terrifying. And that's kind of a fear that this kind of viral fear gets at. But it also gets at another fear. And again, this is the one that the Well-Manicured Man says when he talks about, you know, and maybe we'll talk specifically about the virus in the next scene, in the next minute, but kind of this idea of an interconnected world. Because again, this is one of those fears that runs through 90s pop culture in general, where you had this idea of globalization, because obviously you had the collapse of the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the idea that the entire world was now open, in inverted commas. There was no Iron Curtain dividing the world. There was no real boundary. This idea that, you know, borders were perhaps breaking down as well. The idea that people could come and go for free. I mean, even in Europe, you had things like, say, the Interrail program really taking off, and this idea that you could travel anywhere at any time and it was instantly accessible. And again, you know, obviously you take that to today and you have it going even wilder, where you order things from Amazon and somehow they're managed to be across the world in the space of a day. You can talk to people online via Skype, via Zoom, as we're doing now, and you can broadcast on a podcast and be heard absolutely anywhere. And that is brilliant. That is fascinating and wonderful and amazing and worth preserving and celebrating. But it's also unsettling, because if you are connected in so many ways to so many other people and tied together, then what happens if something gets in there? What happens if something worms its way into that connection? What happens if somebody to whom you are connected and would not otherwise be connected ends up infected or ends up tainted or corrupted in some way? Does that spread to you? I think one of the most interesting kind of visualization of this is, have you seen Rise of the Planet of the Apes?
Yes, I have.
So the closing credit sequence of Rise of the Planet of the Apes, which is about, you know, spoiler alert, about the rise of the Planet of the Apes, or the dawn of the Planet of the Apes, is that there's a plague that wipes out humanity. And the actual closing credits are set with this imagery of planes flying across the world. And the idea is that people from those planes then get on other planes, and then the virus spreads, and it goes across the world and ends up almost wiping out humanity. And I think that, like, that's one of the primal fears of kind of like the fear of this viral contagion in 90s pop culture, was the fear that it exposes the way in which an increasingly interconnected and tightly woven world is terrifying, because there are no boundaries, there are no separations between us and them, there's no insulation. And again, that's one of the things that I think the X-Files does really well with its, colonization narrative. We'll probably talk about that in a moment when we get into the particulars of the Well-Manicured Man, discussing the history of the alien virus. But the idea is that, the aliens in the X-Files, the colonists, aren't, and again, setting up something we'll talk about in more depth in the next episode, they aren't necessarily outsiders. They're inside, and they're connected, and they're not actually alien. They're not actually other necessarily. They are, in fact, perfectly capable of melding with us, becoming one with us, infecting us, corrupting us, and changing us. And that makes it more terrifying, because there is no difference or no barrier between us and them. And again, so, you have that very primal fear, which is something that kind of plays through the X-Files as well. And again, we talked about things like the notion of evil, the fact that Carter keeps coming back to the idea of evil as a virus in, not just in the X-Files, but even arguably in Millennium as well, as something that gets into you in that way. And so it is kind of nice that, even in this big blockbuster summer movie version of the X-Files, you have them hammering that theme very consciously, very clearly, and very strongly. It's like, yep, at the heart of the X-Files is this fear of a viral contagion, but a viral contagion as a metaphor for all manner of other stuff, all the fears and the baggage that come with it, which I find very fascinating and kind of reassuring that the show was capable of doing that, or the movie was capable of doing that, while appealing to mass audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I won't go into it in too much detail, but I know that we've discussed recently on the Millennium podcast about the last two episodes of that season and of the second season, where it talks about the plague and various similar aspects in what you're saying here, and something that we've gone into. But it'd be interesting to see, especially in the situation that we're in at the moment with COVID-19 and the issues that's caused, and as you say, this interconnected world that you can have a disease that spreads so wildly that will spread differently around the world, and the ramifications of that we have to detach ourselves socially. Then the word social distancing's come in, and I think the thing that I see come in now, and it would really be interesting to see what Chris Carter would make of something like this now, because I think that he's often thought of things in the future that might well happen. And I'm not saying he's going to necessarily predict that there was going to be a mass virus contagion from 1998 to 2020, but there's this feeling now of almost resetting, of reevaluating where we are in society, where businesses, how governments are going to reform, how we're going to build the economy back up. Is it going to be the same world in which we lived in 6 months ago compared to where we're going to be in 2 or 3 years' time? Yeah. And that reset button, and how do we manufacture that, and how do we come out of that? I mean, it's almost like starting afresh, and it's really an interesting, as much as a terrifying world that we actually live in now with regards to this virus, which obviously is from a film in 1998, but we do have this we live in this world now. We live in this interconnected world which we have to disconnect from, and it's really interesting going back into this film and contemplating that.
Well, not only that, and again, this is very much Darren reaching, so I apologize for that. It's going to be very, very tenuous, and I just want you to know that I know this in advance. But I mean, one of the things that I've found absolutely fascinating about this coronavirus pandemic, and particularly at the moment, is the way in which it repeatedly and consciously underscores the idea that you mentioned social distancing and isolation, and the idea that how we combat the coronavirus is by isolating ourselves and by locking ourselves away and by minimizing contact where we can. But while that's going on, what's happening is that this pandemic has illustrated how incredibly interconnected not only all of us are individually, but how absolutely everything else is in the world, in the way in which the world that we built, how everything is kind of bound together and locked together and tied together in ways that, perhaps some of us could have predicted, but perhaps some of us can't predict. And again, you have things like the social unrest that's happening in the States at the moment, things like, the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, which are exploring systemic racism and kind of tied to that. But you have even beyond that, the idea of, say, the way in which the coronavirus impacts on things like the economy, things like, eviction and housing, things like working. This idea of just every aspect of our lives being so interconnected with every other aspect of our lives that, there is no real way to isolate. There is no real way to kind of cut it off. and how, while that's obviously in some ways quite good and quite brilliant in that, I think that the conversations that are happening around systemic racism are entirely necessary and arguably long overdue. It's also possible to understand why that's terrifying and why that's scary in the way that it is, in kind of a very existential sort of way. The idea is that, everything is all connected, which is why this fear of contamination is so terrifying and so unsettling, is because we're finally becoming attuned to how close we really are to one another, and how close that is, and how, if something were to get in there, if something dangerous were to get into that space, if something corrupting, and it doesn't have to be a literal virus, it can be something systemic, it can be something organizational, it can be something institutional, even if you want to get, kind of broader in terms of that. But the idea that when something happens, you can't contain it and you can't lock it down. And again, I don't want to turn this into a State of the World in 2020 podcast, but, even things like, say, the way in which the election of, say, Donald Trump, for example, and one of the big narratives that came out of that was the idea that, well, look, it's bad, but it's going to be okay because he will be constrained by the restrictions of office and by, the expectations and social norms and conventions. And as such, the damage that can be done as a result of this happening will be minimal or contained because we have these structures in place that are designed to insulate and designed to isolate and designed to protect what are important facets of kind of life from the influence of, day-to-day operations, and then realizing over the course of the following years that there is no way of insulating, there is no way of protecting, that these social norms don't necessarily hold in the way that we thought they might, because everything is connected and everything ties together and everything is rooted to and tethered to something else as a result. And so as a result, when something breaks, butterfly flaps its wings in the Oval Office and all of a sudden you have, chaos happening down in Florida. It's, again, this idea that everything is connected, and therefore if one little part goes off, if one little, cell is infected or kind of changed or morphed, the entire organism as a whole starts to, get sick or starts to morph or starts to transform and starts to get grotesque and kind of deformed, which is kind of is an existential horror. And I think the X-Files kind of does tap into that. Obviously I'm not saying the X-Files predicted 2020 or anything crazy like that, although, again, we've talked again on the podcast over the past 4 years how the show has sometimes felt uncomfortably prescient in terms of its understanding of American political life, in terms of its understanding of global political life, to be entirely honest. But I do think that there is something very insightful there, and something that kind of perhaps resonates more now than it might have, even when we were recording the original minutes back a couple of months ago.
My God, Darren, you're talking about existential crisis.
I do love, by the way, that Mulder is so unimpressed, by the way. I absolutely love Mulder's deadpan. Yeah. So wait. So you're telling me 5 years, you murdered Deep Throat, you killed my dad, you burnt down my office, and it was a frickin' virus. That's it. Big whoop. There's a real sort of, I kind of love that. And I kind of love that the movie kind of gives Duchovny this kind of deadpan snark where it's like, look, I've had a really, really long day. I don't need this right now. It's a virus. It couldn't even be, I don't know, aliens and like spaceships in a battle fleet or something cool like that. I don't get to like ride a spaceship up and plug my Apple in and blow up the mothership or anything like that. It's a virus with a vaccine. I kind of love that like the movie gives him that moment, and then again, to the power of John Neville, and I've talked about how, the Well-Manicured Man is one of my favorite secondary characters, is able to cut from that back to John Neville saying, my God. And that's enough. It's like, okay, fine. You will take this seriously because John Neville has told you to take it seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. It's brilliant. I was going to say something else and I've completely forgotten.
Sorry.
But never mind. No, it's okay. It's okay. The one thing I did want to pick up on actually is the music, because right at this point where it says on an evolutionary scale they're newborns and this low drone comes out. And right through this scene, even just before that, during the bar scene as well, you get this do 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 kind of theme going on with all the sections, the brass sections kicking off and stuff.
Yeah. Mark Snow has an orchestra.
Yeah, he does. But I'm really impressed by that because it adds to the theme. I know we talked about the noir aspects of the last minute. We talked about the noir aspects for these minutes that we're covering. But I think the music really does actually really well. It's understated, but it's got that memorable kind of melody that throws through the actual these minutes as well. I mean, is that something that you picked up on?
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is one of the things where we talked about how one of the things I actually do really, really, really appreciate about Fight the Future is the way in which it reconfigures the X-Files as an intellectual property, as a summer blockbuster for audiences in the late 90s. And again, we talked about how that means things like giving actual specific numbers in the middle of exposition and kind of limiting yourself to 3 minutes of florid prose and stuff like that, and kind of like understanding that audiences are there primarily for Mulder and Scully to see if they'll hook up, and understanding that that's kind of the big that's as serious a dramatic tension as anything involving an alien invasion. But I think that Mark Snow's score is also kind of illustrates that kind of understanding of, well, we're doing the X-Files, but we're doing it in the style of a 90s summer blockbuster, because you have, again, this use of, as you pointed out, the orchestra, the use of the leitmotif, the use of kind of music and soundscapes, and also the way in which he, again, this is something that Snow does really, really well throughout the kind of movie, is he takes, and again, it feels like this perfect metaphor for what the film is doing itself, where he takes that familiar kind of X-Files-esque sound, the dee, that sort of beat, and then repeatedly throughout reworks it in such a way that it kind of almost intersects with what you would expect standard movie soundtrack to be in that moment. I'm particularly proud of, say, the sequence, or not particularly proud of, I'm particularly thrilled with, I particularly adore the sequence where Mulder and Scully are driving through the desert, kind of tracing the tanker trucks, where you have this kind of adventuring across the kind of United States, and it's recognizably the X-Files theme, but it's also, we're driving across the wilderness in a big American blockbuster music as well, and somehow it manages to be both of those things simultaneously, which is, again, remarkable. It's a remarkable understanding of kind of, and again, apologies for the pun here, but of where Fight the Future is pitching itself, as it were. Making sure that it's all in tune. Mark Snow really knows the score. But yes, but it does kind of illustrate that Snow knows what he's doing and knows where he's pitching it. And again, it is very much that sequence in the alleyway is very much kind of, again, it is a kind of a film noir sort of thing. It kind of has that sound that you associate with the genre. The kind of the sound of kind of like an ominous, again, city, urban landscape, alleyways, kind of spaces and that sort of stuff, and untrustworthy individuals, shifting allegiances, and kind of like, the American city at night sound, basically, which is kind of very effective for exactly what you're doing here. Again, all really, really, really well done, and I think something that, stands to the credit of the movie as a whole. Yeah,
well, I think Caredwen as well talks about those minutes with and actually, as we record, I think we're around that minute at the moment with the car, and she talked about the car being an advert as well. The fact that it was like, oh, look at this car. This is we're in LA now. We're in movie territory. This is a bit of an advertisement for the make and vehicle of this car. But that whole drum beat and percussion and the rhythm section of that scene is a highlight, as well as this one. It's the various different degrees on the theme. But I think we'll call that it for this minute. We need to go then to the following minute, in which we start to talk about the virus walking. So that's what we'll go and do in the next minute, which will be tomorrow. So thank you very much, Darren, for coming back on, and we'll see you all tomorrow. But remember, until then, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. The giddy carousel of pop.
So there's just one thing we need to know. Where were you on the 13th of July 1985?
I definitely watched the whole of Live Aid, sat 2 inches away from the telly. My mum and my stepdad and my stepsister coming in and out and trying to prise me away from the telly and not really managing.
I was in Wembley. I took a day off work. They didn't believe I was going. I had to show them the ticket.
Went to a dog show at Malvern. And saw Auntie Sandra and Uncle Jeff.
I was there. Me and a school friend went. My mum and dad drove us down. They had a day in London. We went to the concert.
The Movie Palace.
So, Carl, what is White Heat about for you?
For me, it's about where the gangster genre is at this point in time. And I think one of the interesting things to look at with gangster films is always like, how do they take the temperature of the time that they're made? So I suppose it comes at a very interesting time in terms of like globally, doesn't it? You had the proclamation of the People's Republic of China, you had the Soviet Union testing the atomic bomb, stuff like that, So there's something interesting about this film, which ends with this big explosion at the chemical factory, which comes along at this time of like nuclear tension.
Between the notes.
I think it's important to remember that throughout the 1990s into the early 2000s, there were loads and loads of chill-out albums that were released, like repeatedly. They were all over the place. My dad always used to collect those. He used to buy them. And Morricone was always on those, which is another sign of how remarkable he was. He could cross over into the mainstream populist sphere, and the score for The Mission was always on those albums, particularly Gabriel's oboe, which is an interesting story. I looked this up. So Jeremy Irons plays the character of Gabriel in the movie, and he performs the oboe. Well, he mimes playing the oboe in the film, and then that's obviously overdubbed with the music.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.